From WRAL News, this is How to Commit Journalism, part of the Capital Broadcasting Podcast Network. Each week, we pick a big story and take you inside our journalistic process. It's your unique vantage point on the news, getting the backstory behind the big story. Today, we're speaking with documentary producer Clay Johnson, who has been with WRAL doing documentaries for the past 15 years, right?
Yeah, it'll be 16 this April, actually.
Well, that's coming up on
It's hard
that.
to believe.
So what number documentary are we airing, do you know?
You know, I do not know that. I think that we have produced over 70.
Tell us how you got into documentary.
It's a really long story. I'll try to condense. I was a broadcast journalism major at the University of South Carolina, but it also minored in media arts and taken filmmaking and cinematography and things like that. So I was really interested in the journalism side, but also really interested in the image side of things. So I went into radio because I couldn't find a TV job where I wanted to be, but eventually took my first TV job in Charleston, South Carolina, and worked at 3 different network affiliate stations in the Carolinas for about 9 years. So
Were
really
you shooting during that time?
No, I did a little shooting in my first job. But after that, I was just, a standard beat reporter. And, I kind of cut my teeth as a producer doing that because, you learn a lot. Covering all these stories on such a wide variety of things, and you learn how things work in the criminal justice system and government and other areas and education. And but I kind of got tired of the news grind, to be frank, and got out of it for a while, and then became a freelancer and did freelance work. And I really started to get into the documentary world a little bit there. I produced a couple of short independent documentaries. I was commissioned by UNCTV, the statewide PBS network, to produce a documentary about teaching, and that kind of really got me super interested in it.
That sounds like a big project.
Right. It was it was almost 2 years, but it was very proud of it, and it aired on a PBS station in just about every major market in the country, and so that was really exciting. But those kind of projects are hard to come by. And as an independent, you have to go out and pitch your project and raise money. And
you're almost as much a salesman as you are a journalist.
And I'm a terrible salesman. So I didn't really understand how that world worked. And so I was doing a lot of freelance producing on the side, some magazine segments for public TV, some network field producing, just a variety of things, producing educational videos, which were a lot like documentaries and kind of filled a niche for me, financially, but also gave me some great opportunities to work on some great projects. But a friend of mine called me in 2004 and said, WRAL is starting up this new documentary unit. If you're interested in doing that, you should give them a call. And I did. And next thing I know, I got offered the job, and
wow,
that's where we are.
I mean, for many people, I think a lot of college students or young professionals would say, this is kind of a dream job. I mean, you get to work on what I think are really interesting topics that you get to go in depth on, travel the state, probably travel beyond the state. Do you feel like this is like the job that you kind of been working toward?
Well, I try not to use the term dream job because I'm afraid it'll inhibit future raises that I might get. I don't know what a dream job is, but it's a great job. I'll say that. And I think the thing that I love the most about it is going out in the world and stepping into everyone else's slice of life. I get out and I go into other people's worlds and learn about their lives and meet a lot of interesting people. So, going into their world, that could be anything from a prison cell to an apartment, a housing project, to a mansion, to a big corporate office that some CEO spends his time in. So you get to walk into all these worlds and learn how other people live. And I think that is the most enlightening thing about it. It teaches you so much about life and, about how other people live. And so from that standpoint, it's hugely educational and just really interesting. And sometimes even fun, especially if we get to do a lighter topic, which is not very often. But to go into those worlds and meet those people and talk with them in an intimate setting and get to know them is just really invaluable.
I bet. And, you say it changes your worldview. And
absolutely it does.
Probably gives, are you like some reporters I know, when they're on a story, are often trying to get an idea for the next story. Do you often find yourself as you're working on one project going, oh, here's a jumping off point for another one?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I was a beat reporter, that used to happen all the time. You know, you'd go out to cover one story and you'd come back with two or three or four more. And yes, definitely in the documentary world, the same thing happens. I would say you get so focused on your one topic for a longer period of time than, a reporter working on a daily story, that, maybe you don't see it as much as when you're out running around. But definitely when I'm out there, going to these different communities and talking to different people and working on a documentary about rural broadband access right now. And I've been in Wilson and Enfield and these little communities, and you talk to people and meet people. And yeah, I've come across some other interesting stories or, even angles to the same story. So that definitely happens.
I imagine that I want to talk about your process, but I imagine going into the shooting or the interview process, you don't always know where you're going to end up, right? You start with a topic or do
That's
you?
true. I always tell aspiring documentary producers there's two rules. Rule one is always have a plan, and rule two is to have the courage to dump the plan if the first plan is not going well. So a lot of times you'll go in with kind of preconceived notion based on what limited research you've done to pitch the topic. But then you get out there and you start exploring the topic a little deeper, and sometimes it's not always what you thought it was. Or maybe it takes a left turn or a right turn. I'll give you an example. We did this documentary called Puppies and Politics. I can't remember when it was. It was probably about 10 years ago. And maybe 8 years ago. But you can look it up on our website.
You can find all of them.
All of them there on WRALdocumentary.com. But Puppies and Politics was about a piece of legislation introduced by an Eastern North Carolina state senator trying to get rid of puppy mills. And so that seems pretty straightforward.
Who's going to disagree with that?
Exactly. Who thinks puppy mills are a great idea?
Right.
And then when I got into it, I realized there was just a ton of politics behind it. That the people, against the puppy mill bill, and there were a lot against, they had these agribusiness interests behind them. And then on the other side, you had the Humane Society of America, and they were the enemy of the agribusiness folks. And so there was all this underlying political kind of intrigue behind it. And, all these conspiracy theories on both sides. And it was just really odd. I was like, and I thought it turned into a much more interesting documentary because of that. So yeah, sometimes things aren't what they seem at the beginning.
I love that. Coming up in the next segment, I want to talk about your process, how you come up with ideas and where it goes from there. Welcome back to How to Commit Journalism, part of the Capital Broadcasting Podcast Network. I'm executive producer Ashley Talley here talking with Clay Johnson. And we've been talking about, how you start out on a story, you don't know where it's going to go. But how do you get the ideas for those stories?
Well, our process has kind of changed back and forth a little bit. But generally, when you're out in the world, you learn a lot about other things that are going on. So that's one source. You get ideas from other people. You stay in touch with what's going on in the news, and you see other issues that people are talking about or that are important to our community or our state. And so they kind of come to you more than you go and search for them. But every once in a while, if I'm trying to come up with some new topics to pitch, I'll go to websites of advocacy groups like, NCPIRG or Sierra Club or Southern Environmental Law Center, see what kind of things they're working on, and just, see what the legislature's doing and, just kind of search a little bit. But a lot of times they do just come to you.
The focus of WRAL documentaries are usually statewide. Is that right?
We do try to take a statewide approach. All our docs are under the WRAL brand or issue-oriented documentaries with a statewide approach to that issue because, all issues are statewide and most national as well. And I think that, there have been a couple of exceptions to that. I mean, we did one documentary on the wine industry but it's a great economic story. So in a way, it was an economic issue story.
Yeah.
And we did a documentary on the anniversary of the Blue Ridge Parkway. But at that time, there was a government shutdown and funding being cut for national parks and park properties. And so that became part of the story too. So it wasn't just kind of here's a happy, fun travel brochure.
Right.
It was more, we looked at the serious pieces of it too. So,
it seems like even the ones that are regional have, I feel like everybody in North Carolina feels a little ownership of the Blue Ridge Parkway or the flooding problems on the coast that you've looked into as well.
One question everybody asks me is, I get this from everybody, do you get to pick your own topics? And the answer is no. What I do is I search for topics that I think will be interesting to the viewers, something they should know about, something they should learn about, and also things that I think, our management here would be interesting in putting on our platforms.
What are some of the ones you're most proud of? I know you've won a lot of awards. You've covered tons of topics. Are there any that just are really close to your heart?
There's, that's like asking, who's your favorite child.
Right, I know. All right, well, just pick one and tell us about a good experience that you had,
I think most recently it was probably Searching for a Fix, which was a documentary on the opioid crisis that we produced in 2017. And, we went out and talked to families who had been touched by this, who opened up and talked to us about it. And it was heart-wrenching and gut-wrenching, to sit there again in someone's living room and have them talk to you about the most painful experience in their life, losing a child to opioid overdose. But I think what was satisfying about it is we knew how important it was to get those stories out there. And so did these families. So there was this sort of cathartic piece for them, but they understood the importance of that story getting out there for the people to understand what a big deal this is and was. And so I was really happy with how that documentary, came together, and that I was able to get those stories out there for people to hear, which I think is really important. But, I think and hope that it really did help make a difference in just raising public awareness, because part of the problem with opioid addiction or any addiction issue is the stigma. People don't want to talk about it. Right. People don't want to hear about it. So if people don't talk about a problem, the problem never gets solved. So
that is a great segue into talking about your most recent documentary, Out of the Darkness. Tell me about how the idea for this came about.
We were actually was sitting around with some people in the audience development division and in a meeting, and this topic came up in a meeting.
Topic of teen suicide.
Of teen depression and suicide. And I started kind of looking into it, and I have a production assistant who does help me with a little research. And I asked her, just do some preliminary stuff. The first thing I always do is look for the real people stories. I think it's, reporting and journalism is not just about presenting information. It's about putting it in a human context. And so the first thing I do on any project is I look for who is the face and voice of this story? Who is the real person that's living this, whatever the issue might be? And so I asked her to kind of just look around, and I gave her some places that she could possibly look. Social media and advocacy groups that work on this issue, that sort of thing.
And she's a college student, right?
Yeah.
A Duke student, so not far removed from this.
No, not far removed from this issue at all. In fact, has friends who've gone through the same thing. But she came across an article in the Daily Tar Heel, which is the campus newspaper at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And the article was written by a young woman who worked for the college paper, a student there, telling her story about dealing with depression since 8th grade and attempting suicide herself. And I read it and I was blown away. And I thought, wow, and her whole point of writing that article was, this is something too many people kept swept under the rug. They don't talk about it. The stigma helps perpetuate the problem. So I'm going to tell my story today. That ends today, at least in her world, is the way she put it in the article. And so I reached out to her and I thought, well, if she's willing to do that, she'd probably be willing to sit down and talk with us. And sure enough, she was. And so I had
that was really the opening of this entire.
Yeah. And, when I read her article, that told me a lot of her story right there, but I wanted to ferret some other things out. And I had a conversation with her on the phone. And then we agreed to sit down and do an interview in her home. It was, I think, during the fall break or one of the breaks from school that she had.
How brave of her to come out in her student newspaper, a first-person account. That's pretty, people don't do that. all the
Yeah,
time with these
yeah.
deep issues that are close to your heart that do have this stigma.
Right. And I have to say from a producer standpoint, a lot of times, especially when it's a controversial issue or a sensitive issue, finding that story is the hardest part. And here it was just kind of laid out before me. And this brave young woman was, yeah, I'll tell my story. I think it's important.
And it's a great
So,
microcosm with which to tell this entire big issue
right,
through
it
her.
was.
Yeah.
So much so that she became the sole focus of the documentary.
And that's what I want to talk about next. Coming up, how this documentary is different from most of them that you've ever done before. We're talking with Clay Johnson about the documentary Out of the Darkness. You've talked about Paige, brave young girl, writes in her student newspaper about her own struggles with depression and attempted suicide. Once you talked to her on the phone, you go to her house. Tell me about that. What happened when you got there?
Well, her mom was there, and she answered the door, and we walked in without gear first, just to kind of, you don't want to just walk in with
Here
carrying
we
gear,
are. Let's
right?
get your
Yeah.
story.
Let's get this done.
Yeah.
So walked in and just chatted with her, and her mom had a lot of questions, and so I answered her questions.
Did you
And
get the sense that like Paige hadn't really talked to her about what all this is going to entail, or she just wasn't really sure?
I think she had an idea, but the more this is just my guess, she's a mom, so
Right.
she's probably thinking about what are going to be the implications of
Right.
this, and
Is this good for my
and
daughter? Should I let her do this?
right,
Yeah.
and what are you going to do with this? And so I explained, and she had already gone to our website and seen some of our work, so she had gained some trust right there. And because when I mentioned a couple things, she said that she had not watched them, but she had seen them on our website, and I planned to watch them. But I explained to her what we were doing. We were interviewing her for this documentary. It was about teen depression and suicide, and we felt that if Paige is willing to tell her story, that will be in a very effective way to get it out to the public. What this issue is all about, and that's really all we're doing. And it really didn't take long to get her to. I mean, we didn't get her to do anything. She just had some questions because she was concerned. We answered them, and she was fine. And so we set up. Paige came in and sat down, and
How did you decide where you were going to have her sit down, or did she decide?
we decided. It's like anything else. It's more, you kind of walk around somebody's house and figure out what's the best place, not aesthetically one, but also in terms of light and sound and how much room you have and little things like that. But
So that's something you and Jay decide kind of when you get to a place?
Yes, exactly. Every once in a while, I have the luxury of sending out, Bree or an intern or somebody to go out and scout a location, but that's rare.
That is nice.
But generally, I kind of knew where they lived, and I knew they had, a fairly decent sized house. And so in a house like that, you're always going to find a spot, living room, dining room, sometimes the kitchen,
Yeah.
sometimes a sunroom, just depends. And so the living room seemed like the perfect spot. It was quiet, and, it had a nice painting you'll notice in the background, this painting of this girl in a boat. No, that is not Paige. But we thought it was interesting kind of in a symbolic way.
Yes, I remember watching the documentary and that's thinking that exact same thing. It's not distracting.
Right.
It's this little detail in the back that, seems to fit really well with the theme.
Exactly. Metaphorically,
Right.
it was this young girl that, kind of looked like it could have been her brunette, sitting in a boat, which, could be, a sort of
A metaphor
a
for what she
metaphor
went
for
through.
exactly. So we liked that backdrop, and it's not prominent. It's very subtle in the background, but we just thought that was a great location. And then we decided, rather than doing the traditional interview shot, we wanted her to look right into the camera because it was such a personal, intimate story. It's so personal.
For people that don't know, what would be the typical interview setup?
Looking slightly off camera
Right.
to whoever is doing the interview.
So you might be sitting beside the camera and you would say, just look at me.
Look at
don't
me.
look at the camera.
Right, which is what we did with her parents.
Uh-huh.
And which is what we do with most interviews. The idea being, especially if there's going to be narration, and this one didn't have narration, but the idea for doing that is the person is supposed to be looking at whoever is the narrator of the story. So that's why someone kind of looks off camera to whoever's doing the. Plus, it's also just more comfortable for people,
Right.
to look
They
at
feel like they're talking to a person, not a machine.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that's probably the most important piece of it is like they're looking at you and the camera's to your left or right. And so that's why on camera you have that slight off camera look and you see it all over the place in documentaries and news and everything. That's why. But we thought because of her story was so intensely personal, and was gonna be at that time, we didn't know, the sole focus of the documentary. We just thought it would be a good way to do it because she would be talking directly to the audience on the other side of that lens, on the other side of that screen. So if you're watching it, you're thinking, "She's talking to me." And if you recall in the screening, uh, our news director, Rick Gall, after watching it, said, "I felt like I was sitting in their living room." And that was the idea. And the other piece of that is she did so it was a little awkward because I was asking questions off camera,
But she's looking at
but
the
asking
camera.
her to answer into the camera.
Mhm.
But she did a fantastic job. And she just did an amazing, incredible job of telling her whole story, in great detail. And when we walked away from that, I was like, there doesn't really need to be anybody else in this documentary except for maybe her parents.
Which is quite different from your normal process, right? I
Right,
mean, normal it's more traditional. We'll hear
right.
from lots of people about this issue, but because her story encapsulates so much of what you wanted to talk about.
Exactly. I mean, as I said earlier, always using that kind of small human story to explain the larger human issue. She did such a great job of capturing, what so many people go through when they're going through depression. And I've never heard anybody explain depression better than she explains that. And then just talking about, the challenges at school, the challenges with her parents, the challenges with, therapy and medications and all that stuff. And I just thought, who could be the better expert than her? And so, yeah, and then we wanted to include her parents because they were living it too.
Tell me
And
about,
so
you say after you talked with Paige after your interview, you look at her mom and she was kind of emotional.
she was very emotional. She said, I'm so proud of you to her daughter. I had no idea that, you could express that in the way that you did, and I'm so proud of you. And so, yeah,
And that's amazing.
yeah.
So then you decided to interview her parents in a more traditional way, but did you have them walk through sort of the same things that you had, or did you have them mostly respond to the things she had said?
Most of the latter. Um, we came back later to do the appearance,
Okay.
to give me a little time to go through her interview and, think about exactly what I wanted to talk to them about. But it was more getting their reaction to what she had told us in her story. So when she was going through this, how are you affected by that? How did you deal with that? So it was them kind of responding. Throughout the documentary, you'll see them kind of responding to some of the issues that she's raising that she was going through and how they dealt with it. Like when she went to the psychiatric ward and they had no longer any control over her, how they reacted to that, which I can't imagine as a parent would react to that.
Me either. And also the fact that she had to be taken in a police car in the
I
back like
know,
a common criminal. And um,
which isn't, you talk about other stories that, there may be one there too.
we're looking into that one right
Good.
now. Um, I think that the parents are quite different in their I'm sure that both of them are coming from a place of love, but the mother is more emotional and the father is sort of more matter of fact. But in some places, it's his words that almost strike you more because he is so direct about it, you know?
One of the things that they both expressed, Scott and Susie, the parents, was that feeling of helplessness. Like, I really wanna help my daughter, but I don't know how to help my daughter. And that's typical of depression because depression is different in different people, and the person who is depressed is often pushing everyone away, and
Or trying to
so
hide
or
the
trying to hide it or, not taking the medication when they're supposed to
right.
be, and, so it's a very unique illness in that way, and I think, they express it so well, like, we just felt like we were powerless. We didn't know what to do, and we thought we were doing the right thing, but maybe it wasn't the right thing, and just you could hear it in their voice what a struggle that was for them.
Her depression and their struggles with it and her parents' attempts to help her kind of build up to this moment when she takes a bottle of aspirin
Mhm.
and goes to the hospital, then has to go to the psychiatric thing. And the end of the documentary, you kind of come full circle, and you see her walking through campus now. How did you want the story to end, or What was your vision for kind of how it was going to encapsulate everything?
Well, the way it did end, or
Yeah.
it hasn't ended. She's only 20 years old.
Right,
She's got a long life
right.
ahead of her. But, I thought the fact that she's now in college, she's doing great, she's working on the student newspaper. So we wanted to bring it back to that point where she wrote the article, and how that has helped in her healing, and how great she's doing now, which is, kind of lends itself to the title, Out of the Darkness. But that's how we wanted to end it because that's where it is today.
Right. She's
So,
thriving.
right.
Yeah.
She's doing great. Her parents are proud of her, as they should be. So we're better to end it than that.
Exactly. I think that's a wonderful place to end it and a great message for teens dealing with this who might watch this, parents dealing with this who might watch it. Yes, it's hard. You have to do these things. You have to make sure that your child is safe. But in the end, they can be wonderful. Like they will go on to live, thriving lives. So
That's right. I hope to keep in touch to some degree and see how she does. And
I bet you will.
Yeah.
Maybe she'll be sitting here at WRAL one day.
She might be. Right.
You never know. Thank you so much, Clay, for talking to us. We could have talked all day about your documentaries.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
To watch Out of the Darkness, click the link in the show notes. To watch any of the 70-plus WRAL documentaries Clay mentioned, go to WRALdocumentary.com or check out the WRAL documentary YouTube channel.